From Community Public Radio, this is the CPR News. From New York, I'm Don DeBar. Today we go to Moscow to speak with analyst Mark Sloboda. He's going to give us a peek what's going on basically in Moscow around him now that the sanctions have been imposed by the U.S. and Europe. Mark, welcome, first of all.
Thanks for having me, Don. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on CPR with you.
And it's our honor and pleasure to have you with us. So what's it like over there? Are the store shelves all empty now and everybody's hiding in the corner shivering, or what?
Yeah, I actually read that in on Twitter, and it's being reported in Western media. Evidently, all my store shelves are empty, and
Really?
there's nothing left, and we're already starving to death over here.
Wow.
That's according to the Western media. In reality, I was literally in just my local equivalent of kind of a corner store.
Yeah, I know the place, yeah.
And I live on the very outskirts of Moscow.
This is the one on the way to the subway to the metro from your
yeah
from your house.
yeah that small store on the way to
Yeah.
the metro there. There's
Yeah.
Okay, so there's absolutely zero empty shelves. There are people shopping quite normally. I don't know what to tell you. It's all just crazy disinfo. There are really no shortages. I mean, what we have seen. Okay, so first of all, these sanctions, and sanctions just doesn't cover it because it is a full scale economic war
Yeah.
by the West on Russia at this point, and an attempted existential. And the explicit intent of this, right? First of all, is to make the Russian economy scream so much that they stop the intervention in Ukraine. But beyond that, they specifically want to make the Russian people suffer so much that they overthrow their own government.
They've said that like
Vladimir
publicly
Putin.
here, like a
Yeah,
number
yes,
of people.
publicly,
Yes.
publicly, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's no surprise. I mean, if you remember back when during the Trump administration, Pompeo talking about sanctions on Iran, basically he said if they want to feed their people, they'll change their foreign policy, right? I mean,
Right,
like
that's right.
just like that, those words, right?
Yep.
So I mean that is the intent, and this is definitely the most significant round of sanctions. Not only that Russia has seen so far, but that is pretty much conceivable. Without completely tanking Europe's entire economy by making them stop buying Russian energy as well. This Russia is now the most sanctioned country by the United States.
Yep.
Woohoo! We're
Surpassed
number one.
Iran. Yep, I saw
Right?
that.
we've pissed off the hegemon more than anyone.
Yep.
And they are definitely. I mean, no holds barred. I mean, this isn't just I mean, there are more and more personal sanctions against Russian officials and oligarchs, as if that's going to change anything. The Russian people don't love their filthy rich any more than the American people love Elon Musk
Right.
or Zuckerberg or
Right.
Jeff Bezos. So that's not going to change anything. And they don't even have. I mean, calling them oligarchs in Russia, that was part of the whole Putin, administration, going back to the 2000 social contract. He drove the oligarchs out of politics, saying you can keep your filthy money, but
Right.
you're out of politics. You can't buy politicians anymore. That's
Right.
done. We don't have that type of campaign finance nonsense. Whereas oligarchs like Zuckerberg and Bezos, and they have real political power. I mean,
Those are oligarchs. I mean, it's hard to
yeah.
call rich guys in Russia oligarchs compared to people like the Rockefellers, for example.
Yeah, in the state companies, the large state companies, those guys are stewards, right? And they do get egregious, compensation
Sure.
for being CEOs, but nothing on the scale of say a private Western company owner.
Right.
And they can and are removed, whenever
Right.
they
don't
are,
perform.
deemed not effective or
Right.
with their hand in the till, uh, or so on.
Your
So
management at one of the biggest oil companies in the world, and it belongs to the state. The people expect that it's going
yeah,
to run properly and it's going to help support the state and their programs. And if not, you're gone because you're getting paid well.
yeah. So the biggest sanctions are the sanctions against Russia's central bank, the attempt to freeze its currency reserves, and Russia does have significant currency reserves. It has continued to build them up during the pandemic. It has somewhere between $600 and $700 billion worth of foreign currency reserves. It had started to spread that out, to diversify, such that the dollar the value of the dollar was decreasing, but it had increased the amount in euros. It also increased the amount in won. So a good portion of that, some 300 billion, is now frozen, mostly in European countries and some other international trade there. So it's basically Russia's money is stolen.
Maybe you could
Uh,
explain to people just what foreign currency reserves are and why countries hold them. But for somebody who wants to do the quick arithmetic, the six to say $750 billion in currency reserves for 150 million Russians is $5,000 in reserves for each and every man, woman, and child in Russia. That's a lot of money in the bank when you consider that the U.S. each man, woman, and child owes about $150,000.
Yeah, I mean, compared to Russia, Russia has 600 to 700 billion dollars just in currency reserves, then
Right.
another 300 billion
In
in
gold.
gold
Right.
reserves,
Right.
right? Whereas the United States has $30 trillion worth of just national debt, not
Right.
state and city debt,
Right.
compounded onto that. So it's pretty obscene. And Russia has a very small, one of the smallest in the world, certainly for a country its size, debt. It's like $50 billion. Notice that its own reserves are many times over. It's basically to facilitate trade and to keep effect of keeping a credit
Yeah,
line
it's like a
open, right?
revolving credit line. Right. Yeah.
But by seizing control of Russia's foreign currency reserves, they're attempting to prevent Russia from making the small payments to service its debt on this
Right.
comparatively very small debt that Russia easily has more money. But the U.S., what with the U.S., commanding heights of the global financial system, they're just preventing Russia from making the payments. And we're talking about the largest country in the world, the country that has so many valuable commodities. Let's start with oil, gas, and gold, and
Right.
and palladium and wheat and all these other things,
Right.
right? But Russia could be declared in technical default in the next week or two. That is possibility as the U.S. attempts through its control of international finance to prevent Russia from making its payments. They're like physically going and stopping you from mailing
Right.
your
There's somebody at
your
the
check to pay
mailbox
your
like, no, don't
debts. Yeah,
deposit that. Yeah. Right.
that's the equivalent. So, I mean, on top of that, Russia has been cut off from, for the most part, not entirely, for the most part, from SWIFT. SWIFT is the global financial transaction system. Like every time you go to make use an ATM in a foreign country, or every time you are making a credit card payment, paying for something abroad, that is being done via SWIFT. And the U.S. and its European allies, they control SWIFT, and they have told SWIFT to stop Russian transactions, except in the case of the Europeans, they had to make some exceptions for the Russian banks that they use to buy their energy that they
Right.
need to
Right.
survive
Right.
from Russia. Those banks, we won't cut off
Right.
because we need it, right? That's the cynicism there. And a lot of people ask the question of why Russia doesn't just stop energy payments to Europe. I mean, energy deliveries to Europe. And the question is, the answer is simply because Russia can't afford to.
Right.
Not yet. It relies. It's a consumer producer relationship with energy that ties you into this reciprocal relationship. And particularly to survive this crisis, the Russian government is going to need the constant influx of funds. It's something like $1 billion a day from Europe, all told, in energy,
Right.
that it will need to survive this. So as much as it might deliver some satisfaction to strike back, you know, you weaponize your economy against us, we'll weaponize our economy against you. Unfortunately, Russia can't afford to do that. Now, in a few years, when another couple pipelines that have started construction to China and elsewhere in Asia
Right.
come online, then Russia might have greater option there. But for the moment, Russia still delivers most of its energy to Europe, and it needs those funds, particularly right now, so it can't do that.
Yeah.
But it of course, I cannot, for instance, use. I can't make international payments now with my Russian bank card, because Visa and Mastercard, connected to the SWIFT network, have been used.
Right.
Now, there are alternatives. Russia has its own um, equivalent that it has constructed over the last few years, since 2014, basically, a mirror card, which means I can continue making all of my payments within the country and in other countries that take the mirror card, which are
Right.
basically the Eurasian Union,
Right.
right? But also, it is Russian banks have a connection. And there is cooperation with the Chinese financial payment system. Sometimes it's called KIPS, but the bank cards use the Union Pay. And so any countries that accept Chinese payments, I will be able to get a Union Pay card, or a card with a Union Pay access, little stamp. So China is helping Russia get around those sanctions, be able to make international payments in countries that ordinary Russians that take Union Pay as well. So it will mean Russia is cut off economically, effectively, from Europe at
Right.
this point, from the West, from
Right.
Europe,
Right.
to a large extent, also South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore has joined in
Right.
for some reason as well.
Yeah.
But almost the entirety of the rest of Asia has not,
Right.
and Africa has not, and
Right.
South America has not. And
Right.
those countries will be under the threat of punishing sanctions from the U.S. for doing trade with Russia.
Well,
But
already
even the
India,
U.S., there's
China,
only so
even,
much
yeah.
they can sanction.
Yeah. Yeah. They're threatening India, China,
Yeah,
Pakistan.
yeah. The West is not the world. I mean, at the day the military intervention was launched, or in the hours after, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan,
Right.
was in Moscow. The first time a Pakistani prime minister had been here in 30 years. And he was, it's so exciting to be, it's so interesting to be here in such exciting times.
Yeah.
Obviously not phased much by it, and he was here to sign major wheat and gas deals.
Right.
So obviously, the West is not the world, and Russia will continue to have economics and do business, even if it has to readjust and belt tighten. And a lot of Russian companies will have to, cut off their existing ties with European companies, and they'll have to find new sources of ingredients and resources and so on.
Yep.
But there is a counter reaction to all of these sanctions. Oh, and of course, you've seen the huge. Every Western company is just pulling out of doing Russia in a business in Russia.
Yeah.
It shows the almost total power that the U.S. has over its corporations, of the synergy between them.
Yeah. Yeah. They're all part of the
kind of-
state. They are. All of them comprise the state.
right.
Yeah.
And he expected this out of Twitter, Facebook, Google, YouTube, the Meta and Alphabet, as they now call themselves, and so on, Twitter, the social media, that the relationship as those social media platforms, as U.S. state affiliated has always already long been clear, But McDonald's and Coca-Cola and IKEA and everything, and someone I heard a philosopher was joking that so McDonald's and Coca-Cola and Pornhub and what was the last one? CNN are pulling out of Russia. Do
Right.
you have any idea what that means?
Yeah, the Russians are going to be the healthiest people in the world.
Yeah, the Russians will be the healthiest, most well-adjusted, best-informed people
That's
in
right.
the world.
Yep, that's right.
These companies are losing money, and the biggest question is, the people that they unemploy that they had been employing
Right.
here, that will hurt the Russian economy in terms of jobs. Some of them are actually continuing. They think this is going to be over soon, which
Yeah.
it's not. This is like forever now.
Yeah,
This is a
yeah.
great decoupling. This is not going to be easily reversed. But there are already Russian domestic industries are already singing praise and joy because now their products have a chance to
Right.
capture all of the market share,
Right.
as well as other countries like China and other India, other Eurasian countries that can also provide
Yeah.
products for the market.
There are a couple things, but it's just to interrupt for a second. One, you saw like a political manifestation of this at the UN twice, but particularly last Friday, where South Africa is not on the council, but China and India and Brazil are, and
Yeah.
all of them were joining in with Russia's and calling for an investigation of the violation of the chemical protocols, and knowing what kind of fury is coming from Washington, and so like a lot of the synergies that people saw, like in the BRIC or the BRICS countries at the very beginning of that, like the early part of the 2000s. You have, and also Russian domestic industry. After the fall of the Soviet Union, so many Western corporations came in and plundered that the domestic firms really never had a chance to get on their feet. And now they've
Yeah.
got some space for that.
Yeah, Russia joined the World Trade Organization way too soon in
Yep.
my mind, and now the U.S. is trying to kick them out of it, which I would be very happy about.
Yep.
But for instance, in 2014, Russia's counter sanctions to the then round of sanctions was to exclude European agricultural products, and it led to a giant boom in the Russian agricultural industry.
I
It's
remember.
huge money now in Russia. It was a big resurgence. So while there are industries that will hurt from this, there are other industries that domestic industries that will grow dramatically as a result of this. So it's
Yeah.
a bit of a give and a take. Another thing the U.S. is trying to do that is very curious and potentially very uh, dangerous and should be threatening to the world is they're attempting to cut Russia out of the global semiconductor trade because
Yeah.
Russian semiconductor production is still pretty small, and even Chinese semiconductor production is small compared to, say, the U.S., Japan, South Korea,
Right.
Taiwan, and Singapore. And the U.S.
Yeah.
has roped all of them into this round of sanctions. And for instance, the biggest Russian domestic car manufacturer, Lada, they've had to shut down production because they're
Running out of chips.
they're going to be facing a shortage of
Yeah.
semiconductor
Yeah.
chips, and they're looking for alternatives right now. But so that could really, if I could, affect the Russian, anything that requires the semiconductor, the
Right.
tech industries, but also the military and so on. And some of it can be domestically produced, and some of it cannot easily be done in the scale that Russia will need. And the U.S. is already threatening Chinese companies over them providing supply of some things. Some things will be much harder to replicate.
Right.
But there's a double-edged sword to that
Mm.
because this is where Russia is such a big part of the global economy. If you're just looking at GDP, it's number 11, but if you're looking at GDP per purchasing power parity, which is actually what you need to compare a country's economic strength, Russia is just after Germany and would replace them again in another year or two
Right.
without this. Um, and it is also the biggest commodity supplier of so many things that everyone needs, right? It's the number one supplier to the world of natural gas,
Right.
which, particularly Europe, China also, really rely on
Right.
Russian gas that way. It is either the number two or number one, depending on the year, supplier of oil. And you're already facing $130 barrels of
Right.
oil it climbed up to last week. It could potentially get much higher.
Right.
Americans are paying up to $7 at the pump already,
More.
and trying,
In
trying to,
California, it's almost 8. Yeah.
yeah. But also wheat. Russia is the biggest supplier of wheat to the world. Russia is the biggest supplier of sunflowers and
Yeah.
sunflower oil to the world. And Americans don't use it, but much of the rest of the world uses sunflower oil in their daily cooking.
Right.
Rye also. We're talking metals, platinum, nickel, aluminum,
Wow.
cobalt, copper. All of these, barley, rye, oats, all these, Russia is either the top or one of the top producers in. And what this is going to mean, of course, is rising fuel prices and gasoline prices in the U.S. When they go up, everything becomes more expensive because of the U.S. reliance on trucking for its distribution network in the country. Right, the price of oil goes up. The U.S. economy screams,
Right.
and that is starting to happen right now.
Yes, it is.
Europe, the same way with natural gas. A year ago, they were paying $300 per 1,000 cubic meters. Last week, the price went up to
Wow.
$3,800 per 1,000 cubic meters,
Wow.
which means that European companies are just shutting down. Michelin, they just shut down their factories because they can't afford to produce anything already. So this
Wow.
is the blowback effect, right? This is, you can't cut a country like Russia out of the global economy and continue business as usual. The whole world is looking at a recession, if not a depression. And while this is going to mean increased fuel prices and ever higher, going much higher than it is now, inflation in the US, in the third world, this is going to mean famine and starvation. Egypt is the country in the world that they're the largest importer of wheat, right? Ironic for a country that
Hmm.
used to be considered the breadbasket of ancient Rome, but
Wow.
modern Egypt, they can't feed their people. They import a lot of wheat, and they get most of their wheat from Russia. They also
Wow.
use a lot of sunflower oil to make bread, and they also get their sunflower oil from Russia. Egypt is facing mass starvation. All of North Africa and sub-Saharan
Wow.
Africa as well, uh, because Russian commodities are now going to be hard to get, even for countries that aren't participating in the sanctions, because of the threat of U.S. sanctioning other countries for doing business with Russia and so on. So this is all going to spiral and get really nasty. And if we get back to semiconductor chips on this, right? U.S. has the production in it, the manufacturing advantage, that and the countries that it's allied with. But what every single semiconductor needs neon, and almost every one of them needs palladium. Russia is the number one supplier of palladium in the world,
Uh-huh.
and it is also, um, Russia and Ukraine together are the biggest supplier of neon, the neon gas that is used to make every semiconductor, and they're like 70% of global supply. It's a byproduct of the Russian production of steel. The gas is then sent to Ukraine, where it's refined and sold as neon. And Now the semiconductors
Wow.
producers, around the world are saying, you know, we're not going to be able to keep going much longer if this
Right.
continues. Prices are already going insane, and soon we may not be able to get it at any price. And this is that double-edged sword again.
Yeah.
Russia may not be able to buy semiconductors soon. No one will be able to make
It
them.
doesn't matter. Right. Yeah. Right. uh, you know, And it'll be easier for Russia, for example, to, provide itself the refining capacity than it would be for Ukraine to provide itself with the raw material to refine.
Yeah. Russia and Ukraine together provide 30% of the wheat exported in the world.
Wow.
That's a third, right?
Third
Think
of
of what that is going to do to food prices.
They feed 2 billion people.
Yeah. So this is why we are all in a downward spiral to the bottom. And I don't think that this is going to end anytime soon, because you know how hard it is for the U.S. politically to remove sanctions once they're locked in.
Yeah.
It took the U.S. 3 or 4 decades to get rid of Jackson Vanik, even when it was no longer had any. It was a sanction on the Soviet Union to do with Jewish immigration to Israel, and long after it wasn't a factor in the Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Union
until way after the Soviet
dissolved.
Union. Yeah. Well, there were sanctions against Cuba that were imposed by the Eisenhower administration.
Yeah. So these I don't see these going away anytime soon. I think this is the new reality. I think we're watching the death of globalization and the global internet, by the way, as we knew it, where everything is going to become much more localized, much more divided. That's already happening, of course, with China, but now with Russia. Russia has its own internet, social media giants that most, for instance, Europe doesn't have any independence there, but Russia has its own major search engine that is the biggest used in Russia, Yandex, and it has its own equivalent of Facebook, very popular in Russia and the former Soviet Union, VKontakte, which I'm on, by the way.
Me too, yeah.
And they also have a RuTube. So they've got alternatives, that the Russian people are already turning to. Right. They had already used quite a lot already. This is going to be a big divisive thing going forward. And I think, we are definitely seeing the last of the nails in the coffin of the unipolar world by the U.S., going to this all-out extent to punish Russia, from overthrowing their regime change in 2014. But it's going to lead to a major splits in the global economy. I call it the great decoupling. Even physically, take a look at airlines. Western U.S. European airlines stopped the flight of Russian airplanes over their airspace.
Right.
Okay, well, Russia, of course, did the same to U.S. airlines, Western airlines. Now, for instance, take a look at the United Kingdom.
Right.
Russian airlines can no longer fly over the United Kingdom.
How do you get to Japan or India?
Yeah. Now, British Airlines can fly over Russia, and Russia is 1/6 of the world's surface.
It's the largest piece of real estate on the planet. That's the wrong game to play with them. It's stupid.
I don't think you thought that one through very well. Another thing, a lot of Russian airlines had actually leased Boeing and Aerobuses from Europe, and now they're like, oh, and you think we're going to give them back to you now?
Come get them, but you can't send anybody through our airspace. I know, it's ridiculous.
So the world is, Russians will no longer be able to fly to Europe or any Western allied country, and vice versa. A whole portion of the globe is going to be denied Western airlines now, and they'll have to fly way out of their way to fly from Europe, fly to Alaska to get to Japan, and all different kinds of crazy routes.
It's not looking good, that's for sure. But we'll keep an eye on what's going on, and we'll let people know, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Don.
Thank you.
And that's all the news we have for you right now. For Community Public Radio, I'm Don DeBar in New York. Thanks for listening.